Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Last year, there were dire predictions of a wave of insolvencies in Australian businesses as government support was removed and the full impact of the pandemic hit. But that just didn't happen. It doesn't mean, though, that businesses are in the clear. And as we approach 2 years of reduced demand and activity, the outlook for business depends not just on the industry they're in, but their location in Australia too. Every month, CreditorWatch releases its Business Risk Index, providing a leading indicator of the health of business. Patrick Coghlan is the CEO of CreditorWatch and my guest this morning. Patrick, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thanks for having me, Sean. Great to be here.
So the report covers October, which is a pretty unusual time in as much as lockdowns were being lifted, certainly in New South Wales and to some extent in ACT. How much did that impact the index?
Look, yeah, it's been a really interesting one, having released this only sort of 2 months ago. And what I think we've learned through the pandemic in particular is the importance of data and how timely it is. You know, you look at the RBA releases and housing price numbers and whatnot, and it's often, a quarter late. And what we need right now is something that comes out, monthly, weekly, sometimes even hourly. So look, there's certainly been an impact. We've seen particular hurt for Victoria, Melbourne in particular, and of course also the Gold Coast.
Okay, so construction still tops the list of sectors most at risk of payment defaults, is that right?
Yes, that's right. So they're actually the slowest payer, and they were, traditionally the slowest payer out of all the industries, even pre-pandemic. Mm-hmm. What we find, though, is they're consistently slow. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they are the highest risk of insolvency or failure in the future. We just know that if you're dealing with someone in construction, relying on someone to pay you from the construction industry, they are typically going to be later, but they keep it consistent if nothing else.
Yeah, which, I mean, in a sense, consistency is perhaps not a bad thing, though I'm sure everyone wants to get paid sooner.
That's right. Look, at least you can cash flow forecast off the back of that at the very least, yeah.
So who's at the top of the list of most likely to default?
So most likely to default at the moment and slowest payer is accommodation, food and beverage,
right?
Which is probably no surprise given they have been locked down essentially for 20 months. There was this huge uproar about the construction industry being shut down for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And the poor, hospitality sector has been locked down almost since, March 2020. And then the second one that comes in there is arts and recreation, which is obviously pretty closely aligned to that accommodation, food and beverage sector.
But potentially both those sectors could improve fairly quickly as the economy reopens?
Definitely. And we're already seeing, receivables gains in those sectors. And then, anecdotally speaking, I'm in Sydney. Trying to get a lunch booking in the city is virtually impossible, which is really good to see. And I actually went to Hamilton on Sunday and it was packed.
Oh, wow.
The play, I should say, or the musical. And it was packed. So it's good to see those venues doing well again.
Okay, so the report also talks about businesses in the accommodation, food and beverage sector that have hung in there during the lockdowns, but probably won't actually emerge from their circumstances as the economy reopens. Why?
Look, there's certainly some question marks over plenty of businesses in those industries that have been hardest hit, like accommodation. The banks, the big banks, and in particular the ATO, so being the biggest creditors by far in Australia, have been extremely lenient and, have been on sort of Team Australia since, the early days of, this pandemic. And they've been supported through. But eventually we will get to a point where the support, has to come to an end. And I think there's obviously going to be businesses that need to be allowed to fail, as harsh as that sounds. They just won't get back to where they need to be. And the debts that they've accrued will just be too great to overcome.
Okay, now the third sector at risk is somewhat surprising. Transport, postal and warehousing. I would have thought that they were real boom areas, particularly during the pandemic.
Yeah, look, this is sort of almost my favourite one to talk about because everyone goes, well, hold on a second, that can't be right, or that's surprising. And everyone thinks of, Afterpay and Coghlan and Zip and, this e-commerce boom.
Yeah.
The fact is, if you look closely at the ANZIC industry descriptions and the actual sort of companies that fall into it, they're quite diverse, even for this particular one. So transport as a whole, no one's flying on Qantas, no one's going on Greyhound, no one's on trains, interstate or, intrastate. So that's put a huge, that industry's essentially been wiped out since March.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you look at couriers, for example, while the ones who are aligned to e-commerce are obviously kept busy, the ones who, would be taking documents within a CBD, for example, have been really hard hit. And there's been this huge adoption of e-signatures, for example. So that's wiped out the need to actually ferry documents around. So yeah, it is a surprising one, but there's some extremely large businesses that fall into it that have basically been doing almost nothing for quite some time now.
Patrick, I like anyone that I interview that mentions ANZIC codes. In fact, that is a first. You are a data man through and through. I can feel it.
That's right. That's right.
Look, the October Business Risk Index also identifies the top 5 geographical areas most at risk of credit default. The top 5 are really just 2 regions, the Queensland border with New South Wales, so Coolangatta, Gold Coast, that area, and then parts of southwestern Sydney, Canterbury, Bringelly, Green Valley, Marylands, that sort of area. I can understand the border closures around Coolangatta, why that's there. The southwest Sydney, is that because that's where the epicenter of the lockdowns were?
Yeah, look, that's right. So there's quite a number of elements that go into the index. So obviously we've got the CreditorWatch dynamic data, which is looking at trade receivables, so how businesses pay one another, but also, defaults and whatnot. And then we've got information coming through from AFSA, which is around bankruptcy, plus socioeconomic and geographic information. So if you consider Southwest Sydney is traditionally, a lower socioeconomic region, there's a higher rate of individual bankruptcies, personal insolvencies there as well. Plus, you then lob in the extended lockdown and the really harsh lockdowns that we had in those areas, and that's heaped a lot of pressure on them. Similar to that Coolangatta and Gold Coast region, you immediately, understand that they have a high need for tourism to come through, and when that's switched off, it puts pressure on. But the other thing that goes into that area is there's quite a high cost of living, so particularly around residential and commercial rents and property prices. So when there's a downturn in revenue, that puts a huge amount of pressure on. Whereas if you're in an area where the rents are low, there's high sort of socioeconomic wealth, and there's a downturn, they can actually shoulder it a lot better. So that's why those 2 regions in particular have been hardest hit.
Stay with me, Patrick. We'll be back in a minute. My guest today is Patrick Coghlan, CEO of CreditorWatch. Okay, if you bring it all together, what are we seeing in terms of, you mentioned bankruptcies in areas of southwest Sydney, what are we seeing generally in terms of businesses going into administration or bankruptcy? We were worried about this, we've spoken about fiscal cliffs, we've spoken about huge increases in administration.
Zombie apocalypse.
Zombie apocalypse, that's better. None of it actually has come to fruition yet. Where are we on that timeline? Are we going to hit that zombie apocalypse or not?
Yeah, that's right. Look, and I'm firmly on the record multiple times for saying it was coming, but the extension of the safe harbour legislation, plus of course a huge amount of liquidity that was pumped in with JobKeeper and that extension through to March 21 rather than September 2020 has done a tremendous job of keeping people employed and keeping businesses alive. The fact is we're still in this synthetic environment and we're still sort of 30 to 40% below pre-COVID levels in terms of company administrations, company insolvencies. Now, the question I guess people are asking now, will that surge or will there be a sustained increase? And we're quite optimistic. It's going to be a sustained increase back up to and probably maybe slightly above pre-COVID numbers. It has to happen. That's it's always been consistently that sort of 8,000 to 9,000 insolvencies a year, and it will get back to that, no doubt. The big driver of that will be when the banks and the ATO get back into their normal collection rhythm, where we start to see them wind companies up. So they're obviously in contact with their customers and their debtors, speaking to them. They're offering, payment arrangements, for example, but they're not sort of pulling that final trigger to say, okay, we've got to wind you up here or put you into administration. But that will come. And our best guess, having spoken to plenty of people across government, for example, is probably mid next year, closer to the end of the financial year. They're certainly not going to start to do it pre-Christmas. They want to see the economy bounce back through Q1 of next calendar year, and then you'll probably start to see the banks do it a little bit sooner than the ATO. And of course, not to be too cynical, but we also have a federal election coming up.
Surely not. You also monitor a few other metrics, including credit inquiries, defaults and court actions. We started this, your very first answer to my question was about how important data was. all those sorts of things. Are they showing any changes? Are they still relatively subdued in terms of defaults and court actions and things?
Yeah, they have been, and they're almost, they're sort of lagging indicators now.
Yeah.
And they're what we have always reported on for years with our business risk review. We've now launched the Business Risk Index, which is a forward-looking index for insolvency risk, which is really powerful. But these metrics still play a really important role. Credit inquiries, I look at that as almost the heartbeat of B2B trade.
Yeah.
It is debtors applying for credit accounts. It could be trade credit. It could be insurance policies. It could be finance, right? And then you have, of course, on the other side, creditors performing searches, performing inquiries to check on the viability and the risk that these debtors, these applicants pose. So we saw that bounce back really well through the first half of this year. Of course, once lockdown hit New South Wales, it tapered off, came off a little bit, and it's sort of plateaued, through to at least the end of October. But we anticipate that will start to climb again. Defaults and court actions, much like administrations, are at 30, 40, 50% down on pre-COVID numbers. Defaults started to come back in sort of March, April, May of this year, but then, once the lockdowns came, it came off again. So they're interesting, what I would call false positives. They look good, but really they have to turn around eventually.
Data, Patrick. That's what it seems to be about.
We love data here at CreditorWatch.
What I think is interesting, there's lots of debate about the Reserve Bank, for example, waiting for things to happen rather than being preemptive. And the banks now are releasing a lot more credit card data. There's the Roy Morgan ANZ weekly consumer sentiment index. One thing COVID has really brought to the fore is better use of data. Would you agree?
100%, yeah. And it's put pressure on the government in particular as holders of, huge amount of good quality data to release it, at least on a monthly basis rather than it being sort of a quarter behind.
Yeah. Patrick, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Great to be here. Thanks very much.
That was Patrick Coghlan, CEO of CreditorWatch. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join me every morning for the full Fear and Greed podcast with all the business news you need to know. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.